Meanwhile, the Independent Electoral Commission has given assurance that its voter management devices will operate without glitches. It comes ahead of this weekend's voter registration drive. The public will also be able to check their details on Saturday and Sunday from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Deputy Chief Electoral Officer Masego Sheburi joins us now for more on that. Good to have you, and thank you very much for coming on this evening. What's the number of registered voters do you need to have a credible and complete voter roll for the 2024 elections?
Good evening, Thabo. There is no golden standard, but one of the tests of a healthy democracy is the rate of participation by eligible citizens. We have 26.1 million registered voters out of a possible 39.7 age-eligible citizens from the recently released Census 2022 data. So on our part, we wish to enroll as many age-eligible citizens as is possible.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you look at that, it means you have a target of about 13 or so million people that you would want to register. Why set yourself only a 1 million target for this weekend? I'm asking this because in 2016, for example, your first week of registration, you got about 3 million people. Previously to that, I think it was 1.5 million. You seemingly have been doubling every time this first registration weekend happens. But this time around, you're setting yourself a mere 1 million.
Now, the context of a 1 million in our earlier teleconference was that we're hoping that if we could achieve that in this registration weekend. However, we are aiming to enroll as many people as possible. That is why our systems are geared for an influx and would wish to have an influx of voters into voting stations and those who would wish to register online. Certainly, we're aiming for more than 1 million. 1 million was just a number that would said if we have that as a minimum, I would think the registration weekend would have been a good yield.
Yeah. What sort of measures have you put in place for disruptions? Like we saw in 2016, there was a number of protests, public protests. It was largely around the issues of demarcation, which we saw in Limpopo and KwaZulu-Natal, maybe barring the Free State where there was not much of disruptions. That's one area. We are, of course, seeing a lot of inclement weather, and those could also bring about some delays, for example, in when those stations open in parts of the country. And then you have the question of load shedding disruptions as well. What are you putting in place?
Let's start with load shedding. We do not think load shedding will be a big issue for the registration weekend. We operate from 8 to about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The devices that we are using to register voters can hold charge for an continuous use of about 6 hours. So we think in the majority of voting stations, they will be able to operate if fully charged. They also come spec'd with external batteries, so we will be able to revert to an external battery should that be necessary. So we do not think that load shedding will be too much of a factor for this registration weekend, but it will be so for the general elections that must happen sometime next year. As it relates, to inclement weather, obviously we are crossing our thumbs because the weather patterns have become so disruptive and so unpredictable. We're working with state entities responsible for disaster so that even where we are challenged because of temporary voting stations in the main, we could be able to regain operation without losing opportunity for people to inspect their details and those who want to register to do so.
Yeah, and the question of public protest, because if you remember, the International Security Institute did some studies around a trend that was beginning to emerge of aggrieved individuals or groups who choose to undermine the other registration processes or even the voting processes themselves to express their grievances. One, what have you done around election security, but also around strengthening those kinds of dispute and conflict resolution issues?
Two things. We have deployed conflict panelist capabilities in local areas to anticipate issues of conflict and try to resolve those before they turn violent. As a general provision, the Electoral Commission welcomes the right of every person to voice up their grievances. And in so doing, we wish that people would also respect the rights of those who want to participate in democratic processes and not disrupt the registration or any election activity. However, if that fails, we are working with the state apparatus in the country who are still responsible, even on registration day and on election day, for maintaining security in the country. And we hope that those plans that the SAPs have put in together will be implemented if it gets to that. But we hope that people who have a grievance can raise those peacefully without interfering with the rights of other persons who may want to participate in democratic endeavors.
Yeah. Speaking of grievances, are you watching carefully this public spat going on between the EFF and SATU? And the comments made were that we must make sure that the staff members of the IEC are not SATU members, because SATU said is going to support the ANC, and therefore SATU is an affiliate of COSATU, and that could be a problem. And this, of course, has created some kind of back and forth. Firstly, of course, in law, there's nothing that would disallow a teacher from participating in IEC processes just because they are affiliated to SATU. So if a leader of a party says we must make sure that staff members of the IEC are not SATU members, it must raise concerns for you.
Look, on our part, we would have preferred that the registration process goes on without side spectacles. Having said that, we do not want to minimize the concerns that are being raised about perceptions of impartiality by some of our officials. And because this is not a new thing, it is not a new phenomenon, the issue of SATU have arisen in every election since at least about the 1999 elections. What the Commission has done in the intervening period is that we derive a criteria against which we recruit people who work as election officers together with political parties. Once agreed on that criteria, we recruit staff, we train them, and before we confirm them into positions and at voting stations, we give the names of those persons to political parties so that they can give to their local structures to check if those persons are politically acceptable. They don't have a high political profile. They were not candidates in election. On our part, we check against our databases to check if the persons were never candidates in an election and if they were never in elected positions, if parties were registered with us. So those are the mechanisms that are intended to isolate persons who are not desirable and not to raise objections against a class of citizens like teachers or SATU members. We do not have a policy in the IEC to employ teachers, neither do we have a policy in the IEC to employ SATU members. Where objections are raised against the impartiality of a person and those are sustained, we blacklist those persons never to be used again in the Electoral Commission. But however, it would be unlawful if the Commission were to implement a scheme that says a person who is a teacher may not be considered for deployment as an electoral staff in the country or a member of SATU, because in any case, we have no databases to check if a person is a member of SATU or any other trade union for that matter in the country. All of us in the Electoral Commission are citizens. We have rights to vote. We have political views because of those things. So if we can participate in the election, surely people who work in voting station to administer election, carefully considered, carefully vetted, should be able to participate if their purpose is purely to serve the South African nation and not to serve partisan political interests.
Yeah. So as you put it, I mean, you're saying it's not a new phenomenon, it's an issue that has been raised previously. In both those processes, whether it be the National Political Party Liaison Committee or the Regional Political Party Liaison Committee, how have you dealt with this issue in the past if it has been raised in those platforms?
In the past, we have reviewed our recruitment criteria. And we've agreed together with political parties that given the rigors of an election, you still require a person who manages a voting station to have some level of supervisory experience. And therefore, we have a requirement that a person must have supervisory experience of a couple of years of employment. So in certain localities, it is unavoidable to have teachers who play that role. Historically, we have relied on teachers in the main because most of our voting stations were schools. However, that number has reduced drastically. To illustrate the point, for this registration weekend, we have just over 69,000 persons that we are going to use. Only 5,000 of those are employed persons. The balance are persons who are unemployed. So you can see that the issue of teachers, while it is peddled in the media as a big thing, it has become insignificant. It pales with the traditional statistics that we come from.
Yeah. Speaking of those statistics, more voting stations for registration. You were at 22,569 the previous election. You're now at 23, I believe, 1,296. What's the thinking? What's the rationale in that expansion?
Ahead of each electoral activity, we review the settlement patterns, where there are new developments, where there are densities, increase in population. We create new voting stations to provide convenience to voters. Again, the demarcation of voting districts and positioning of voting stations, we determine that together with political parties at the municipal party liaison committees, and each party signs off on a delimitation map as a sign that they agree with the creation of a new voting station and they agree with the location of a voting station. So voting stations are intended to make sure that people don't travel for long distance to access a voting station, and that once they've reached a voting station, they don't spend inordinate amounts of time in a queue before they can exercise their franchise.
Let's go back to the 2016 ruling. I mean, at the time, 2.8 million addresses were missing, 3.5 million were incomplete. Where are you as far as those numbers are concerned?
When the Concord made that decision in CAM in late 1995, late 2015, early 2016, we had only about a third of the people who were registered on the voters' roll having addresses. As we speak now, we have 95%, estimated 95% of persons on the voters' roll who have an address or a description of where they ordinarily reside. The court did not say the voters' roll must absolutely have addresses in every case, because it accepts that an address does not obtain in all social milieux in the country. So we are at 95%. The duty that we have is to make sure that when we register a person, we either get an address or we get full details from that voter so that we place them in the correct segment of the voters' roll. That does not mean, however, that an address is now a precondition to registration as a voter. When a person presents at a voting station over the weekend, we'll only ask them to produce their identity document or a temporary identification certificate issued by the Department of Home Affairs, and they must provide us with an address that will take on face value. They don't have to prove address by way of utilities bill or a statement from the municipality. They give us an address, and on that face value, we will register them in a voting district that is linked to that address.
So the three groups that you're possibly looking at, and maybe there are more, you'll tell me, but from what I can deduce, there's new registrations, there's re-registrations in those who will be voting in different districts, and there are those who will come to confirm an update. Is that really what you're looking to see in terms of the number of people that you're going to be dealing with this weekend?
Yes, and because of that order of the court in 2016, would encourage everyone to come to a voting station, to inspect their details and confirm their details. So, for example, when they come there, we'll ask them for an address, we'll capture that address so that we have an address provided by a voter on record. That's the first category of persons. The second category would be persons who may have moved since they last registered. And for that category, there's a word of caution. A person may present at any voting station to apply for registration. It doesn't mean that they are entitled to vote at the station at which they presented, because with the new technology, we can now use the technology to register a person wherever we encounter them, but we are driven by the address that they provide, and based on the address that they provide, we will default them to a voting district in that area. An example, Thabo may present in Hyde Park to register when he's ordinarily resident in Cape Town and provides a Cape Town address. We process him in Hyde Park, but default him to his home VD, the VD linked to the address that he has provided. The third category are persons who are registering for the first time. And we hope that the youth will heed our call to come out in their numbers to either register physically at voting stations or to do so conveniently from anywhere over our online portal for registration of voters.
Yeah. So that's rather important, because if, for example, I could be here, we don't know when the date is, and we are waiting for the president to proclaim when the date is, but I could be here for work purposes, but on the day when I have to vote, I could be maybe staying in Cape Town and I'm back home. What is important for me to remember there? Because I will be registering in Sentin, but on that day I could possibly be back home.
Your question implicates two possibilities. There are persons who know that they do not consider Johannesburg home, and they know that on voting day they will be at their home base. So you provide your home address against which you will vote on voting day. There's another requirement. If a person who is registered in Johannesburg knows that they will be in Cape Town on the day of an election, that person must give pre-notification in a time that will announce in the timetable to indicate that they will be voting outside of their voting district, so that we can make provisions for them wherever they present themselves. It is no longer possible on election day to go to any voting station and ask to be included on that segment of the voters' roll. It is now by pre-notification.
And how does that work when you then are collating the votes? So my provincial vote, does it matter where I'm ticking the ballot in terms of where it would count? Will it count in Gauteng even though I voted in the Western Cape?
Okay, let's use an illustration. Thabo wants to vote in Gauteng. He's registered in Johannesburg, but for work purposes, he's in Pretoria on voting day. If you've given us pre-notification, you'll be entitled to your 3 ballots. You'll vote for the provincial legislature, and you'll have your 2 ballots for the National Assembly. If, however, you are registered in Gauteng, but find yourself in KZN, but you have given us pre-notification, you will only vote on the 1 national ballot for the National Assembly. You won't be able to vote on the regional to national ballot, nor will you be able to vote on the provincial legislature, because you are outside of the province in which you are registered. Yeah. So the principle being that you should not influence outcomes of an election in an area in which you are not resident.
Right. So preferably to vote in the province in which your address resides, and so that you can get all the 3 ballots as per you would wish to do. We've had this conversation of the voter management devices back and forth, and the question of them going on the offline mode and the logistics of that. And the big question again, you're saying that offline mode capability is still there. And what we saw the last time was people would then present in one voting station because it's offline, and then go to another voting station and still be able to vote because the system would not have picked them up. How do you deal with that?
2 things. The device is intended to give us 2 capabilities. One, to register voters correctly against their home addresses at the point that we interact with the voters. On election day, the devices maintain the national voter register. And if a person votes in one station, proceeds to attempt to vote in another, the device will indicate that the ID number has participated in that election. In the majority of cases,
even in the offline,
the device will work. In the majority of cases, the device, if we have connection to GSM networks, it will work properly. In offline mode, it's just a default mode to say, rather than stopping the voting process, you can proceed, and once the device has established connectivity, it will update the databases. So in the majority of cases, it should be able to work like that.
All right, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much for coming on. Deputy Chief Electoral Officer there, Masego Sheburi, with the IEC on their readiness for this big drive coming this weekend on voter registration.